Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to learn to cook, but not in the conventional sense where we're going to follow all the rules. In fact, what we need to do is discover where do we get our chops in cooking, and how do we become that kind of person that becomes the kind of cook that we do in the kitchen. Well, that's what we're going to discover today as we talk about the true life story of one Chef Rossi, known as the Raging Skillet, which is a wonderful catering business out of New York City. She's going to be sharing her marvelous story with us and how she became inspired to be known as that Anti-Caterer. Chef Rossi, welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be
here.
Crazy
stuff. Now, I know that you're a big Barbra Streisand fan, but first I want to know about the Cinderella thing that you did.
Oh, you mean when I was a kid, I did Cinderella Flash Fantasy.
There you go.
Which was a modern spin on the Cinderella story, sung to the tune of the B-52s and David Bowie. So it was kind of like a punk rock Cinderella story. I've been thinking about that a lot lately.
It's kind of funny how the certain things come back, and I know when I started, as I was reading your book, one of the things that flashed back to me is how you were kind of like me. You remembered most of the 70s, but not all of it. And you know the maxim, if you remember the 70s, then you weren't there. But, you know, some of us actually grew up at a particular time where we were young enough before we started flashing our brain cells. And I think you and I probably started doing that at about the same time. But here's the thing.
Oh, yeah. There's definitely a few gaps in there.
Exactly. I think it was right around 1977, or was it 76? I don't remember.
For me, it was 78 to 81.
Right, exactly. But what really struck me, I hadn't heard this word in a long time, and it's going to be kind of silly to bring this up, but Almaden wine.
Oh, yeah.
Boy, did that take me back. I was thinking of Blue Nun and Cold Duck, all manufactured by Two Buck Chuck.
I didn't even know that wine came with a cork until I was 17.
Right.
I mean, you were always screwing it off. So we would be like sitting there doing all kinds of crazy antics, and it was always like a big jug of screw-top Almaden wine.
Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to being that anti-caterer, how do you feel that you actually started getting that title?
Well, when I first got into catering and into professional cooking, it was in the 80s. In the 80s, food looked kind of gorgeous, but it was very two-dimensional. It might look pretty, but it tasted like linoleum. And I was like, why can't we marinate things? Why can't we give it a crust? Why can't we give it some love? So I started cooking like the way you would really want to eat at home. I mean, with really like chicken that we marinated for 2 days and just gave all kinds of love. And I would cater weddings, and people would say, I never had food this good at a wedding. So they're like, you're not a caterer, you're like the anti-caterer. Plus, the other thing is caterers, at least, the ones I knew in the 80s, were notorious for telling little, shall we say, fibs. And I never could lie my way out of a paper bag. Like you definitely don't want me on a poker game, trust me. So I just kind of molded my whole business on just telling the truth. I mean, like I remember once I had my very first client with a cell phone. This was back in the days when no one had a cell phone. And she was profoundly wealthy. She was calling me on her cell phone going to the Hamptons, and she had gotten her party planner on the line on his cell phone coming back from the Hamptons, and she had had an epiphany that she liked lamb and she liked raspberry jelly. So for her menu, she wanted lamb and raspberry jelly as the entree. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And it's like you almost heard the 20-car pileup on the LIE. She just went, Aah! What? Why on earth not? Because no one had ever said no to her. And I said, because it's gross. She went, oh, okay. And from that point on, we had a great relationship. It also kind of sums up how I am with clients. I'll tell them, if I think their ideas are horrifying. But I also like to coax out their dreams from them. Like when I sit down with a client that I first meet, I try to find out if they had one meal left to live, what would they eat? And maybe that's the meal we serve at their wedding.
And that's so true, too, when it comes to cooking. You always hear people this day and age always talking about how, we just don't really have time to cook. We're always on the go, and I think to myself, who is that busy that doesn't have time to cook at least their favorite meal? And that this is something that you should be doing because it's kind of like a religious rite of passage, isn't it?
Well, it's like about self-love. Loving others. I think the whole reason I'm a caterer is because I'd probably get arrested if I wasn't. I'm always trying to force feed people. I grew up with this lesson that food is love, and I guess I feel that way, So it's just a question of how much you love yourself.
Now, when it comes to food, you really learned your lessons, especially at thrift, from your mother. She was pretty good about that, wasn't she?
Well, my mom, she was really an over-the-top Yiddish mama. And I had this very odd childhood where we were raised what you might call lowly Orthodox. This meant like we kept the meat and the dairy dishes separate, but we ate the fish sandwich at McDonald's. That's the best way I could explain it. But we were also raised kind of white trash. Like my dad got some swampland in the Pensacola Riviera area. And so we grew up eating this crazy white trash but kosher foods. Like, so as an example, I may be the only person you'll ever meet who can actually say I've had kishka and grits. So that
Wow.
kind of sums that up. And my mom was like a notorious, overfeeder. Like if you just ate what was on your plate, that was a terrible insult. You had to have seconds and thirds. But she also just packed a lot of love into it. It wasn't really the kind of food we wanted to eat when we were kids. We wanted like pizza and spaghetti and sort of kid food. Instead, we'd get a goulash that like was simmering for longer than relationships I've had. But she did put a lot of love into it. The problem was that my mom got her first microwave when I was 13 years old and promptly never wanted to cook anything again. We would get a call to the dinner table by like the microwave dinging, ding, 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 and there would be some horrible astronaut food in styrofoam plates. And that was the moment that I decided I was going to start cooking because I was tired of eating the astronaut food. So I put Lender's bagels in the oven and put ragu tomato sauce on them with some grated cheese. And suddenly I pulled these pizza bagels out of the oven. And my family was like, oh, my God, what is that? And also the oven, they hadn't seen that in use in a while. And then very strange things happened after the night of the pizza bagels. Like my dad started asking me if I minded before he changed the channels. My sister stopped stealing underwear from my bedroom. My brother stopped wiping his nose on me. And I was like, wow, this food stuff is power. I guess you could say I got instantly hooked right then and there.
It's funny because as I was reflecting it in the book, you really tinged on the late 70s especially, and just like you, in our family, we had acquired a camper through my mother's marriage where this guy had a camper. And what was really funny was when you were talking about, for instance, the time that you invited a gentleman over to your house by the name of Mr. T for dinner, which
right.
You said was highly unusual. Tell us about that.
Well, we never had anyone over. I mean, my mom's only friends, I guess, were at the sisterhood at the synagogue, and my dad had some guy he played racquetball with. But there was never a witness to the kind of horrifying weirdo life we had in our house. And I had this old man that I was friends with. He lived next door, and his name was Mr. Thompson, but we called him Mr. T. And I didn't know, I formed a friendship with him. I was a teenager, and he was in his 70s, but we got along. So one day, I invited him over for Thanksgiving, and he was so happy. For once, he wouldn't be at the church. He's a lonely old guy. And he came to our house, but after seeing things like asparagus coming out of the can and food that was so cooked for so long it was like jerky, really kind of horrifying stuff. And then a turkey cake from Entenmann's, I guess it was Tom the turkey cake, that my mom had gotten for sale for like $1 because someone sat on it. He was like fairly horrified and suddenly never became available for any invitations again. He was just like, I think I'll go to the church.
I know you were describing the plastic silverware. You said that was probably one of the things where he decided he had other things to do. And I was reminded of the plastic silverware, the styrofoam bowls that we used to eat out of when we were out camping.
I know. Everything was disposable. I think my mother had an allergy to washing dishes, so we wound up with all this disposable stuff all the time. But, on Thanksgiving, you kind of want a real plate. I mean, something that has to be washed later. Anyway.
Now, it
That
was
was the end
interesting.
of Mr. T.
Now, what was interesting, too, is that you start sharing the story of how you came into cooking and how you got into the restaurant business to learn how to become a caterer, which you eventually spouted off to create the Raging Skillet. What I loved about your story in here is sometimes you'll read stories about chefs that may put out a memoir or people who have been in the business for quite a long time. But yours had a reality to it. I mean, as you described the people you worked with, the situations you were in, such as Delias, for instance, you realize here's somebody who really knows how to communicate what actually happens in the kitchen and the relationships that you come across. And it really becomes a thing that almost seems fictional.
I've had a very crazy career. Like I always say, it's kind of like I came in through the outdoor. It started because I was a bartender, and I was one of those old school kind of bartenders you never see anymore, where I would light your cigarette and tell a joke, and I knew everyone's name, and it was kind of like the Jewish version of Cheers, Anyway, the kitchen would close, and I would be stuck with my 30 drunks with nothing to feed them but like Pepperidge Farm goldfish. So I started going to the back of the house to make them things to eat so they wouldn't get drunk and throw up on my bar. And I don't know, I would make these crazy concoctions like buffalo chicken nachos and stuff like that. And I really liked it. It was very popular. A huge crowd started forming for my late night creations. But I started really getting this kind of buzzing feeling in my solar plexus. So I thought, maybe I'll just learn how to cook. Well, the problem was that this was the 80s, and women were not welcome in the kitchen in the 80s. So I got a job at Avery Fisher Hall, which is a giant complex, right in Lincoln Center. And they had to hire me because they were afraid of a class action lawsuit, I think. But the chef would do anything he could to make me quit. I mean, like my first day there, he gave me 3,000 strawberries and wanted me to dip them in chocolate. And they didn't offer me a bathroom break or a lunch break. And I think he was taking bets with all of his Mexican line cooks on how long it would take for me to quit. But luckily, I was blessed with two things that kind of worked for me. One was I had a really filthy mouth. And the other was I had a lot of what you would call chutzpah. So after I dipped my last strawberry, I went into his office and cursed him from this way to Sunday. I mean, I won't even, just use your imagination. And then I was like, keep your job. And I threw the apron at him. And he was just like impressed with my array of curses. He was like, no, come back tomorrow. And that became the beginning of my career. And I just kind of like worked my way through life, just being very funny and being able to curse with all the men and having a strong work ethic. And eventually I got out and became a chef myself and then owner of my own company.
Now, have you been in touch with, I believe it was Jim that you're talking about. Have you been in touch with him since then?
No, the last I heard, he had gotten a job for this colonial theme restaurant out in Bucks County near New Hope. And I went to see him there, but it was really painful because he and I had become good buddies, but seeing him dressed up like in colonial wear and feeding tourists, I mean, it was just kind of sad, and I never saw him again. I certainly don't think he still has that job, but I don't know what happened.
How about Gerard?
Gerard, oh my God, what a horrible man. He was the most racist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, pretentious little bastard I ever met. I never saw him again after the day that I quit, but the way that I left was, it really left a good taste in my mouth. I heard from people in the industry that he didn't actually improve with age, but I know I never saw him again, and that's just fine.
Yeah, because he really had that French attitude that, it reminded me as you were writing and talking about him is, living here up in the Northwest. In fact, it was just a couple of years back I had met up with a gentleman, and he was from New York, and he opened up a little winery, sort of like a little retail wine shop restaurant. And it was funny always listening and talking. You always seem to hear this from New Yorkers. They leave New York and go to another state, but some reason that state doesn't know how to do a damn thing. Not like they do in New York. New York seems to be the only place where they do it right. I'm thinking, are you out of your mind?
Well, the only thing I will say about that is, it's not, I think, that New Yorkers do anything better than anybody else. We just do it a little faster. Now, New Yorkers have to move really fast. I don't know what it is. It's like this adrenaline in the city. I spent a lot of time in Los Angeles because my dad moved to California right after my mother died. And in the last 5 years, I took over as his caretaker and just about everything you might want your daughter to be for you. So I went out to L.A. every other month. And I would go up to someone and ask questions like, do you know where La Cienega is? And so in New York, it would be like 3 blocks down that way, if they even took that long. And the person in L.A. was like, well, if you walk that way, and then, by the time they were done, I was like, I wanted to kill myself. I was like, who has this kind of time? Thank God my iPhone would just tell me faster.
Yeah, and just never visit Indiana.
Right.
I'll never forget my experience in Indiana the first time getting into a cab. And then I was serving in the United States Navy, and I was on my way to my journalism school. And so the cab driver, she was really funny because she kept looking up in the rearview mirror, and there was apparently something about me she had never seen before. And so she began to talk about how she had been driving cab for about 25 years. She had never seen a sailor before. I think it took her close to 10 minutes to say all that.
Oh, boy. Oh, boy. I feel your pain.
Now, when historical events happen, many of us can also kind of remember where we were when that happened, such as you asked somebody, where were you on 9/11? But you had a pretty interesting experience the day Elvis died. Tell us about that.
Well, it happened that the day Elvis died, I was in a fat lady's clothing store in Georgia. My mother was very heavy, and I was what you would call then husky. That was like a nicer way to say fat. So my mom had dragged us to this fat lady clothing store in Georgia. And really it was just like a lot of polyester and a lot of pastel and a lot of things you did not really want to wear in the summer. Periodically, the woman in the store would go on the loudspeaker. And she'd be like, ladies, there's a sale on slips in aisle 2, and they're real pretty. And then all the fat ladies would run over to aisle 2. Well, so I'm trying to kind of hide because my mother was threatening to make me wear some horrifying dress. I think it had polka dots on it. And the woman comes on a loudspeaker, and she goes, ladies, Lord, help us. Elvis is dead. He's dead. And it was like pandemonium. The ladies were crying, and their kids were crying, and polyester was flying. I mean, it was something you could never, ever, ever forget.
No doubt about that. Now, as you're developing your skill, you really like to, as you say, kind of change the game a little bit. Now, it's really interesting when it comes to, becoming a chef because you're seeing more schools pop up. What I can respect about what you talk about in the book is that you were more of, let's just learn on the job, because after attending a bartending academy, as you had experienced, you realized, I'm not going to go that route again.
Right.
And it was really interesting because I had spent some time in the industry actually doing the various things such as cooking and bartending and serving and so forth. And I'll never forget a time that I was actually serving a family where there was this young girl, that's exactly what she aspired to do. She wanted to be a chef. She wanted to eventually open her own restaurant. And what I suggested to her, and I said, well, you know what you ought to do, as soon as you're old enough, go work at a Denny's or something like that. Somewhere where, as you were talking about, you start developing the skills and the speed that you need so you become familiar, because becoming a great chef is just a matter of repetition, such as you talk about in your book, dipping 3,000 strawberries in chocolate, things like that. People don't understand. That's where the real skill comes from, is doing and doing and doing. And her parents were insistent, no, she's going to go to college first. And I said, I'm feeding your daughter pearls here about how to break into the industry at a young age to develop the skills. Maybe she can go to college later. But they were insistent, no, she's going to go to college now. And all I could do is just shake my head like, that just seems kind of sad. What are your thoughts on something like that?
I'll tell you, I had gone to the International School of Bartending, and I learned how to perfectly stir a martini and exactly what an ounce and a half shot was like. And then I got my first bartending job, and people screamed when I poured an ounce and a half shot. They were like, "Are you crazy? I needed to pour 2 or 3 times that." And nobody was ordering martinis. They were ordering beer. So I kind of spent the whole first year I was bartending unlearning what I learned. And when I started cooking, I guess partially I did not aspire to go work at some place like Le Cirque. If you're going to go work for Le Cirque, then yeah, you maybe should go to cooking school. I aspired to cook the kind of food I loved. I loved Cajun and Creole and West Indian and Mexican fun food. This was years before other people were doing that. Plus, I didn't have any money, so there was that as well. So I kind of just did the earn while I learn school of cooking. And then when I started my own business, I noticed that when I would hire people, if they had gone to cooking school, took like the whole first year I was with them to kind of break them. They would be like, "Well, this is a beurre blanc," and I was like, "So what? Put jalapeno in it. There's nothing wrong with a jalapeno beurre blanc." "But that's wrong." "Good. That means it's going to taste good." So, maybe I don't do the perfect chiffonade, or maybe my mother's sauces have things in them that Jacques Pepin would not approve of. I don't know. But I know that we do great food and has a lot of soul in it, and all the cooks I love either never went to cooking school or, had a long time of being broken in afterwards.
And I love that you stretch out like that. It's important for listeners who may aspire to maybe go this direction with their lives is that you have to break the rules, because that's where the newer creations come in. And I'll give you an example. As I was working in a small sort of like a breakfast dinner house, and I used to open up in the mornings and make the soups. And this was a very small chain of restaurants that was owned by a gentleman, and his mom would always come in. And I can't remember what it was that she was even doing there besides pissing and moaning and basically smoking cigarettes and talking about how great her son is, right? So I'm making the soups, and she's watching me make them. She says, "You're not making it right by the recipe." And I said, "Well, so what?" And she says, "Well, don't you realize these are award-winning soups here?" I said, "Really? Well, come here. Let me show you something." This is when I had first started the first week or two. Took her into the walk-in, and I said, "There's all your award-winning soups for the last week sitting on the shelf almost full." Said, "My way, the pots go in the dishwasher because they ended up becoming empty."
Right. Your way
I said, "Now, which would you rather have, an award or something you can actually pay your lease with?"
I've always hated recipes that, like this, that don't leave room for a little creativity. And I write recipes for people who hate recipes. I think everything is meant to be played with, a handful, a smidgen, a little bit of love. I think, like, for me, recipes, like if I'm looking up a recipe for some sort of exotic thing I'd never cooked before, I'll look at like 10 different recipes to get the essence of the idea. And then I kind of like shove it into my brain in a filing cabinet called, OK. But then I take it from there. I just made, for the wedding last weekend, I just made Senegalese chicken yassa. So aside from the fact that I once had a Senegalese chef, what do I know about being Senegalese? I'm Jewish, But I got the essence of it, that it's a lot of fresh lemon juice and a lot of cooked down onions. And after I put that in my brain, I added a little bit of jus and a little bit of white trash, and out came the best Senegalese chicken yassa anyone had ever tasted. I'd make it again in a heartbeat.
And what I like about the recipes that you have in The Raging Skillet, the memoir that we're talking about here today, is that, it's that each one of them actually fit with the story of how you came across that. But to give the listeners an idea of, how you actually develop or have the ingredients, for instance, a decent iceberg lettuce salad, 1 head of iceberg lettuce, a heaping plop of crumbled blue cheese, a plop of mayonnaise. And you think to yourself, it's so interesting. Anybody knows what a plop looks like versus, what, 22 milliliters of what? I don't even have those tools in the kitchen.
It gives you permission to, just play. I was just on, in New York, I was just on the Eyewitness News, and they had me do a show just before Mother's Day on repurposing things that you might find in your kitchen to do fun things for the kids. So I showed my Snickers casserole, which is a recipe I invented when I was 13 years old and extremely stoned, actually. And it was melted down, chopped up Snickers bars and butter and marshmallow mixed with potato chips, and then pressed into a mold and then cut out for these shapes, whatever you wanted to. So I was showing them off and showing the little triangles. The second they went to a commercial, everyone, the weather girl and both anger people, they ran over and like pigged out on them because you don't actually have to be stoned to enjoy them. The only downside was that I said I had invented the recipe when I was 13 years old and stoned, and the producer didn't like that very much. I'm like, come on, this is the news. You just finished talking about a crack bust. Like, why can't I say that? What can you do?
Yeah, what can you do? Everybody likes to be politically correct, don't they?
I know. It's like I get it, some parts of it, but sometimes I feel like people are kind of selling their soul a little bit.
You know what I think would be interesting, too, is for you to take the opportunity to go to Italy and actually see if you can pawn off that hot dog antipasto salad. When I seen that, I was like, now, she's like me. You know, as you were talking about, you'd kind of get a little stoned and start creating things, and it's really funny what you create. And then you think, man, this tastes good, and then the next day you're kind of scratching your head now. How did I put that together again? That's the 70s.
I know. You know, I just was in Italy. I have some friends there, and my girlfriend wanted to celebrate her birthday there. And I would like to say that I had an enormous culinary exploration, which I did to some extent. But the problem was I drank too much red wine, so I didn't do a great job of culinary exploration.
That'll happen when you're in Italy.
Yeah.
Now, it's funny because when you talked about this particular recipe in the book, that same restaurant that I was talking to you about where I was making the soups that we're actually selling, is they had brought in this guy, and he decided, you know, because we were allowed to also, of course, create the lunch special or the dinner special, whatever the case may be. And he decided that this particular night he was going to create this particular special. And it was funny because there was another guy who was working there who was talking to me about this, and he was going to culinary school. And this was a guy you could see going to culinary school was beginning to change his mindset on things. Like he was becoming this super chef. And I'm thinking, but you're just flipping eggs and hash browns here. There isn't really anything complicated that we're doing here. And he kept talking about, you know, if I could just share the knowledge of this or that and the other, and, you know, but he was a nice guy, well enough said. But when he took a look at this guy's special for the evening, he was like, well, this is the kind of thing that they serve in old folks' homes, isn't it? And that was the shepherd's pie. And that was actually the first time I'd ever heard of shepherd's pie, is when this guy decided to run this thing as a special, which none of it sold. So he had this big hotel pan full of shepherd's pie, and nobody bought it.
Oh, well, you know, a good shepherd's pie is a great thing because then you have that meat and the potatoes and the whole thing. We do them as an hors d'oeuvre, actually, in my company, like mini shepherd's pies. But a bad or boring shepherd's pie or shepherd's pie in the fall or the winter is not a good thing.
Now, what was unlikely was where the shepherd's pie was in relation to the kind of people who came to the restaurant or nightclub, if you will, that it was served at.
Uh-huh. It wasn't happening, huh?
No, I was talking about the place that you discovered the shepherd's pie.
Oh, Delias. You know, that was crazy. Well, Delias was ahead of its time. You know, this was back in the day when nobody went further east than Avenue A. I mean, it was so dangerous. Delia was this famous debutante. I think she was supposed to be an heiress or something or other. I never really knew. She opened this restaurant on 3rd Street between A and B, you know, back in the very dangerous days. And it became a darling for very wealthy people. Like John Kennedy Jr. was always there. I mean, it was full of models and celebrities and Kennedys, and limousines would be parked out back. And it was a totally illegal supper club. Like the bouncer had this button after the dinner ended and people were dancing, he would press the button if the cops were there, and the DJ would turn off, and the disco ball would turn off, and all music and dancing would stop, and people would just stand there. Like, there's no dancing. I didn't have a cabaret license. Anyway, Delia hired me as her chef, and her shepherd's pie was her claim to fame, but it was really boring. So I started doctoring it up with A1 sauce and ketchup, coriander, anything I could find. And people just loved it. She never knew. She just thought it was her old recipe that people were loving. But unfortunately, I got fired, or fortunately, I got fired, because she had gone into the walk-in and eaten all the food prepared for a party. So I gave her a steak for her supper that was like this little scrawly end piece. It sort of looked like the state of Florida. And that was kind of like my exit. I have a very good way of quitting jobs.
If you're going to leave, just make sure there's a style that you do it by, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. When you were talking about French chefs and snotty chefs, I got this job at this place called the Amazon Club, where they had taken a whole pier in Tribeca and dumped sand on it and made it like a Brazilian forest. And I guess they weren't really expecting a lot of people to come. I don't know what they were expecting. But the kitchen was just in this trailer. And they hired this very snotty chef, a 4-star kind of chef who wanted to chiffonade herbs and make mother sauces and on and on and on. Yawn. Anyway, suddenly 1,000 people were coming to party and eat there. And they wound up taking that chef away in an ambulance. He actually had a nervous breakdown behind the line and started 86ing himself and 86ing everything. And they hired this guy named Eric, who was really a short order cook kind of a guy. He could flip 1,000 burgers and, very simple guy. And he was able to handle the place. So it was really much better to just have a talented short order cook than a French chef, in this environment.
I think one wonderful philosophy that you live by, and it was so interesting when I read this, is that because I have the same attitude as someone who actually would train people in kitchens or maybe even the front of the house, and you had 3 keys to how you go about creating a good team and a good, happy environment, because, there'd be times you might be spending anywhere from 8 to 12, maybe even 14 hours a day in a kitchen, and so you need to have some levity. You got to really have a sense of humor behind that, or you're going to end up using the tools on someone else instead of the food. But talk about those 3 things that you believe are very necessary, because I really respected when I seen this, about anybody working with her should be having a good time as long as they're doing their work.
Well, you have to, first and foremost, you have to have a strong work ethic. Because nobody likes to have somebody who's a slacker while they're working hard. You have to have an amazing sense of humor, because cooking for a living is very painful. It really is. So the way you get through the day is by making jokes. Particularly, chefs really like to compare things they're cooking to parts of the body, like filet mignon always looks like a penis and papaya always looks like a vagina, things like that. You have to be decent and honest, and you have to really love food. In our kitchen, every time we try out a new chef, usually the first day we know immediately if they're going to stay or not. If they don't want to laugh at any of our jokes, if they don't understand any of our jokes, if they take 2 hours to make one sauce, we're just like, oh, forget it, get them out of here. And you can feel the negative energy. We keep a positive energy in the kitchen, I guess because in the kitchens I worked in the 80s, people were always yelling. It always was like screaming and yelling over nothing. I make it a policy that no one's allowed to yell in the kitchen. So that way, if you really do hear someone yelling, you know it really is an emergency. And no one's allowed to treat anyone else disrespectfully. So everyone calls my kitchen the Zen Kitchen. It's big and open and clean and quiet, and, everyone's nice to each other.
See, and I always wondered about that, because you watch shows, for instance, like Chef Ramsay's Hell's Kitchen, and I think to myself, how is it possible to be able to be effective and to be consistent when you got some guy shouting at you all the time? It just doesn't work, especially when you start getting in the weeds, which can happen.
It's not. It just makes everyone on edge and everything worse. I've never met Gordon Ramsay, but I have to say, if I was working under him, I probably would spit in his tea.
I would agree with you. I think I would, too. And he certainly probably wouldn't read the book, which I encourage a lot of people to do, because what I know that you share in your stories is if this is a direction a person wants to go with their life, this is a book that can be very inspiring, because you realize, well, if somebody maybe like you can do it, well, maybe so can I. And it just takes one step at a time, patience, and just the yearning to learn, to grow, and to be creative.
There's like a few things that have helped me out. Like, one is just never saying never. because, I mean, I've had such a crazy, impossible life. You know, I ran away from home when I was 16. I was sent to live with Hasidic Jews in 1981 in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, which I got to say is one of the most dangerous places in the world, Crown Heights, Brooklyn in 1981. I mean, now you'll have to wait an hour to get brunch, at a corner table, but 1981, no, And I kind of fell into bartending and fell into cooking, and I think the thing that saved me was just that I was always honest, and people respected it. So even when I had cooking jobs, and my boss would say, can you make I can't really example right now, but can you make a foo-foo thing? I would just say, how do you make that? I wouldn't pretend that I knew what they were talking about, and I think my being so honest disarmed them, and then they would just say, oh, it's just this and this, and I'd be like, oh, that's nothing, and off I would go. When I first got into cooking, I pretended that I had a lot more experience than I did, and so whenever I got the menu, I'd run out and buy a cookbook. So if it was a Cajun menu, I'd run out and buy a Cajun cookbook, and I would have all my friends come over to my apartment and practice on them. So it was kind of a good time to be my friend. You were eating a lot of free food.
Yeah, that's what it's all about. You've got to get the experience by practice, practice, practice.
Mm-hmm.
No doubt about that. And you said something, too, that I think is very valuable to know, and that is be willing to ask questions. If you don't know something, ask. And I remember when I would bartend, somebody might come up with a drink, and I'd say, I've never made that. What's in that? And all they would have to do is tell me what's in it. If you know how to, do the job, you're going to be able to make it. And sure enough, they'd say, well, this is how it's made. And I'd go, okay. So I'd put it together, and you know what? This is fantastic. And it was the first time I ever made it, but all I needed was just, well, what's in it?
A little direction.
Just a little direction, absolutely.
People come and meet me all the time in the kitchen, and it's like they always want to play Stump the Chef or something. I don't know what it's about. They love very often to mention something that they feel is just so fabulous. And when I first got into cooking, I might try to fudge it a little bit, but now I'll just say, I'm sorry, I have no idea what you're talking about. Would you like to explain the recipe or email me the recipe? Or, I'll just be very honest with them. And then they'll say it's, whatever it is, and some, Chinese noodle dish or that they had while they were vacationing or whatever the crap is, And I'll say, well, you're having a cocktail party, so generally speaking, Chinese noodle soups are not great for an all past hors d'oeuvre cocktail party. But, I could do a spin in a little espresso cup, and we could pass it that way. And, and then it just sort of turns into a great relationship. But if they had come in and tried to ask me about something I didn't know what they were talking about, and I lied, people can smell a lie. It feels bad to me. It feels bad to them. And that sort of sets the pace for a crappy relationship.
Which, the key underlying theme in this whole thing that you're talking about is the fact that when you actually ask, it engages the person to be a co-participant in the creation. And that's what makes it very exciting because, they're going to say that, well, she really didn't know how to do this, but, I kind of suggested it. Man, isn't it fantastic? So they kind of take ownership of it.
Right.
That becomes your best form of advertising.
It's a great thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, I have to say now I've been catering weddings for 27 years. And they told people, and they told people, and they told people. So I do very, very little advertising. It's all word of mouth, and it's kind of a nice way to live. So usually if someone calls me, I've already catered their cousin's wedding or their friend's wedding or whatever, So we're already off on a friendly foot,
Now, it's been a real pleasure to have you here on the program today to talk about your memoir, The Raging Skillet. Is there a website people can go and discover more about how to get the book and more about what you're up to?
Sure. Well, they can go to theragingskillet.com, which is not only the website for my catering company, but there's a whole section that's just for the book and where to get the book. And it has my links to find me on Instagram and my Facebook page and my Twitter page and all that social media, blah, blah, that I'm pretending like I'm so savvy, but meanwhile it's like, thank God I have a 19-year-old goddaughter. I wouldn't know what the hell I'm talking about.
Don't you know it? I have to leave on this note, though. This might be fun for the listeners out there when it comes to maybe creating an appetizer. We know that when you go to parties, everybody loves when these particular appetizers are available. What would you say is let's call it the anti-deviled egg?
The anti-deviled egg, well, deviled eggs are great. So, you can get any recipe for a deviled egg, and it's great. But I'm kind of partial to taking, those sweet pickles, like a good sweet pickle, and dicing it up and doing that as a garnish on the top and a little bit of smoked paprika. I think that's kind of gorgeous. Something like a deviled egg already is an anti-catering kind of thing because it's great and homey and a little bit white trash. So, you throw a little bit of sweet pickle garnish on it, some paprika, and then treat it like it's beluga caviar and elevate it on a beautiful tray with orchids. I'm coming with the deviled eggs, my dear. It's kind of great.
Maybe a little bit of sriracha in the egg mix, too.
Oh, yeah. I'm old-fashioned, so I still throw Tabasco in. What can I say? The hipsters do not approve of Tabasco, but I like a little Tabasco in my deviled egg.
Very good. Chef Rossi, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today.
You're welcome. I had a blast.
You betcha. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. Again, the book is The Raging Skillet. It's the true life story of one Chef Rossi, joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. You can also discover more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter so you can stay up to date on what's coming up and what we're into. You can follow us on Twitter at Beyond 50 Radio as well as Facebook. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.